This is your second book on,
Yes.
on Reagan. The first one was called and became a bestseller.
The first one was called Reagan's Revolution, which is where he begins the process of remaking the Republican Party.
You've been active politically and in public relations, and what turned you into an author? You really felt you needed to...
Well, I've always loved history. I was a history major in college. I've written over the years many articles on history and spent my entire life writing for other people. And I decided at some point that I wanted to start writing for myself, and so I was able to get a book contract for the first book, and that was got good reviews and was bestseller, and which now led to this one, which is now leading to other books.
If Reagan were with us today, what would he think of Sarah Palin, the tribalism we see in politics? I mean, he and Tip O'Neill would really get along extraordinarily well, as he and Sam Donaldson got along extremely well, actually.
Yes and no. Yes and no. And in fact, I read about that, he and Tip O'Neill. That is somewhat of a myth. They got along at certain times, but Tip O'Neill wrote in his own autobiography that he thought it was a sin that Ronald Reagan had been elected president, and he also said that he thought Ronald Reagan was the worst president he'd ever seen in his lifetime. On the other hand, to O'Neill's credit, and maybe it bespeaks an earlier time of politics, Llewellyn, was that when Reagan was shot, O'Neill went to George Washington Hospital and snuck into Reagan's room, and with his rosary got down on his knees and prayed at Reagan's bedside, and together they recited the 23rd Psalm, and then Tip O'Neill kissed Ronald Reagan. So it does bespeak an earlier time, a gentler time in American politics. But the idea that they were very close friends is somewhat of a myth.
If there was a gentler time, I remember as a reporter when you were writing about people in Congress, and you would have to get the book to see which party they were in. You know what their opinion was, but you might have to check. That, of course, is not true today. Actually, it's not been true since really the revolution in the 90s. Since
but you had I see. Here's the silver lining I see to that, because you're right. Is that the parties are polarized. The Democratic Party is organized around the concept of justice. The Republican Party generally around the concept of freedom. Although that went off on a tangent under George Bush, where it became security became more of the organizing principle of the Republican Party, replacing Reagan's freedom. But you don't have liberal Republicans per se anymore, and you don't have conservative Democrats. So the parties are much more polarized in the European sense.
But well, it's looking a lot more like parliamentary government, where being a member of Parliament is not a terribly useful thing.
Right.
The conservative writer in England, Matthew Paris, left Parliament because he couldn't see any point in it.
Right.
You vote the way they tell you, you make a speech when they tell you to, and it's kind of, you lost something of the specialness of, I think, of the presidential system and the open politics where anybody can run. In Europe, anybody cannot run for Parliament. In Britain, at least, which I know best, you have to be selected by your party, which means a lot of backroom politicking, etc. One of the other crises that Reagan dealt with was OMB and Stockman. Stockman saying, this is nonsense. This supply side stuff is absolute nonsense.
Trickle-down economics.
He got in a lot of trouble, but it also caused people to doubt whether Reagan was on the right track there. If he's top money man at
all
OMB,
we can do is go by the results. Is that in his presidency, 19 million jobs were created, inflation was abated, interest rates came down. He was able to overcome the Carter recession of late 70s and early 80s. I hope the viewers and people read this understand that this is not a hagiography. This is not a big wet kiss to Ronald Reagan. This is, I'm worked for him, and I'm an admirer. I'm not a worshiper. And this is the good and the bad about Ronald Reagan, but it's the facts about Ronald Reagan.
Let's show the book again, so that maybe you'll do some good with it. I hope so. Your other book is a big success. What do you think of today? I mean, what is the Palin force? I mean, Sarah Palin has captured the imagination of if I might say so, one of the shallower parts of a formerly deep party.
She represents a certain strain of American populism. I would say that the Reagan strain of American populism would be almost like a Thomas Jefferson, a natural aristocracy where man rises to the highest level of achievement. She represents more, I think, of an Andrew Jackson strain of populism, which is more blue-collar rooted, which is more anti-Washington, anti-concentration of power.
Well, because we've had Republican after Republican run against Washington,
yes,
and then has come to Washington and immediately fallen into the ways of Washington, which is spend and grow the government,
right?
As Teddy Roosevelt did,
right?
You know, and. One just wonders, you know, is this just empty rhetoric, or is anybody actually going to shrink the government at some point?
First of all, Reagan did cut discretionary spending by 13.5%. He used the veto more than any president since Dwight Eisenhower. The government spending as a percentage of GDP shrunk during the Reagan 8 years of his presidency.
Let's talk about his triumphs.
Yes.
There are many people who believe, of course, that he brought down the Soviet Union. That both with rhetoric and with military expenditure, he cornered the Soviet Union and it collapsed.
Right.
My own view is that there was some of it, but there was a fatigue in the system in the Soviet Union that was going to fall apart by itself. But he might have sped it up. He might not have sped it up.
Oh, I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that he did speed it up. There's two facts I go to because there some academics and historians will say, well, that, and the Nobel Prize Committee gave the Nobel Prize to Mikhail Gorbachev for sticking his head in the guillotine, but not to Ronald Reagan, which I think is one of the great travesties of the Nobel Committee, is there are two facts that disprove the idea that they worked together to end the Cold War. One is that no Soviet leader ever willingly gave up power from 1917 up until 1991. No one ever willingly gave up. Number two is that the Soviets gained territory against every American president.
Except for term limits, there haven't been that many Democratic leaders that have given up power, in my knowledge. Margaret Thatcher didn't give it up, you know.
The Soviets never, the Soviets gained ground against every American president from 1917 up until 1981.
Clearly, Craig, you found an enormous amount. You've written one large book, has another book, you're working on others.
Right.
Are you going to become the Martin Gilbert of Reagan, Martin Gilbert being the man who's made a career, very successful and very good career, out of writing about Churchill?
Right. I joke that people say, why do you write books? I say, well, I want my obituary to say that I wrote books. So, and being compared to Gilbert, I think would be a great honor.
He's a very nice man, very modest. I've had the pleasure of meeting him.
Yes, absolutely. Great, terrific historian.
Another historian who has had a lot of difficulty with Reagan is Edmund Morris.
Yes.
How was it this very competent historian did a biography of Reagan and couldn't find enough to fill the biography out that he had to insert himself? You know, this book was called Dutch, by the way, and very criticized by other historians. As, the methodology was bizarre.
Well, I think most historians would question a historian channeling himself into the story and putting himself in Dixon and Tampico with the young Dutch Reagan.
We used to, when I was a young reporter, we made jokes about New York Times reporters saying, Mr. President, what's worrying me is, and there was some of that element, very strange in the history.
Yeah, well, that was the criticism. He had facts wrong in his book, little facts too, which you would think that Ed Morris would have had an army of researchers, but he wrote that Gerald Ford had 3 children, when in fact Gerald Ford had 4 children. He had the wrong date for when Reagan announced for the presidency for the 1976 nomination. He had the wrong date in November of 1975.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Almost 4 years.
And how much time? I mean, you have a business to write.
I worked on it every day. No less than 5 hours, and sometimes as much
Sometimes
as
when you write,
12
we're
hours.
nearly out of time, but sometimes when you write about somebody, you change your opinion. Did you change your opinion about Reagan at all?
Yes. Yes.
For the better or for the worse?
For the better.
Really?
For the better. Because I realized how nuanced his thinking was.
We have to go, Craig. Thank you so much for coming on the broadcast, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
We will be back next week at the same time, and if If you want to see this program or other programs, you can do so at whchronicle.com, where you can also read my scribblings. Cheers.